I'm Bill Whitty, and I'd like to welcome you to another season of Power Switch, a program dedicated to a more fulfilling and self-sufficient lifestyle for each and every one of us. As we face the latter part of this century, it becomes obvious that the techniques for survival have changed. We face challenges that our parents and their parents simply didn't have to deal with, two of the most dramatic being the high cost of energy and inflation. And if you couple that with the fact that the population is no longer rural agrarian, but industrial urban, dependent on a highly complex and technical support system, we become acutely aware of the fact that we have a whole new culture trying to solve a whole new set of life circumstances and problems. Air of some type in order to operate. Where does the combustion air come from? The room, heated air that you've already paid for. So what we have to do is find another way to allow the fire to burn without using up the valuable heated room air. We can accomplish this by outfitting our fireplace with these glass doors. They prevent the room air from going into the fireplace, and we can give the fire its needed combustion air by providing it a vent to the outside. Then we have the benefit of the fire burning through the glass, and we're not wasting our heat. So those are the components in a passive solar home, but there's still a little logic left that we have to think about, and that's plan organization. Living spaces in most houses can be divided into three functional zones, which would consist of occupied active zones, occupied passive zones, and transient zones. Occupied active zones are one in which the occupants of the house spend a great deal of time. Examples would be the family room, kitchen, and dining rooms. Usually these zones are occupied during the day, which is significant at passive solar design because they're usually grouped along the southern face of the house in order to receive heat gain through the use of one of the three passive heating techniques. In the evening, when the sun can no longer contribute significant amounts of heat, the occupants of the house have usually moved to other areas, and any heat stored then is distributed, if possible, to those zones. Occupied passive zones are those areas in the house which are occupied at some period during the day, but ones in which the activity is more passive or sedentary. Examples of this type of living space would be bedrooms, the traditional parlor or living room, which is seldom used, or even a den where the activity is quiet. These spaces would receive a secondary priority when deciding which rooms could be adjacent to the sun wall because they are used less often, and in the case of the bedrooms and den, have a tendency to be used at night or during early evening when the sun is no longer contributing heat energy. Often in the organization of passive solar designs, these spaces are placed more to the rear of the house, but adjacent to the rooms that are receiving heat so that they too can gain from the internal heat distribution. The third category is the transient zone. In rooms such as closets, hallways, stairways, furnace rooms, the activity is usually brief, with less requirement for a high degree of comfort level. These spaces are usually located to the rear of the house, near the north or cold wall, and any solar heat that they receive is usually piped in through the fan and duct system. One other key element in the plan logic is the usage of an airlock technique at the entry foyer. This prevents, through the use of double doors, precious heat from being lost each time a person enters or leaves the house. Almost always, the entry airlock should be placed on the lee side of the house so that it cannot be affected by the prevailing winter winds. So as you can see, there's an awful lot of planning that goes into a passive solar home, but the critical factor is the execution. If the home isn't built right, then all the planning in the world is wasted. And one of the most important facets of a passive solar home is its thermal envelope, or its insulation. And to better understand how the insulation works, we thought we'd take a look at this house during construction. Think of your house as a big container filled with heat. And this is heat that you have to pay for when you pay your power bill each month. Now, heat has a very special characteristic, and that is that heat always goes from a hot place to a cold place. And that means in the wintertime, when it's cold outside, the heat within your house is going to be seeking a colder place to go, and that's outside. And when it goes out, there goes your money, out the window. Only it's really out the cracks of the house. Now, the walls of your house are the part of the container that keep that heat in. And these walls are composed of three components. There's the wood structure, which holds the house up. There's the insulation, which is kind of your thermal package, which keeps the heat in, hopefully. And then there's the siding, which protects the house and keeps the water from getting in the house and on the insulation. Now, in energy houses, the most often neglected component of the house is the insulation. And this is critically important. The more insulation that you have in your house, normally, if it's properly installed, then the slower the heat loss from the house. That means you're saving energy. Now, the thicker the insulation, the better the insulation, with one exception. It doesn't do any good to have terribly thick insulation and then have cracks all around the insulation that the heat can take a shortcut and get to the outside. Now, a good example is on this energy house that we have behind us. And you'll see that the insulation is placed in sheets. But around these sheets are just hundreds and hundreds of cracks. In fact, the entire surface of the house is nothing but cracks. Now, if we were to go and put the siding on this house, then we would have a very vulnerable house in that we would have a large percentage of that surface composed of cracks. And these cracks are no more than heat leaks. And that's where the heat will go out the building in spite of the insulation. So the critical thing for you or your builder to know in an energy house is that, number one, we have to conserve the energy that we're making or we're trying to save. And that is first by putting adequate insulation in, and secondly by ensuring that all of these cracks are covered. And this is usually done by some sort of taping or putting building paper, whatever. But you must make sure that these heat loss cracks are covered up. And one way to check for these cracks is to go inside your house and look at the wall surface. Any place that you can see light coming in, well, heat can go out. And that's a place that you have to effect some sort of a remedy and cover the crack up. So in an energy house, conservation is the key ingredient, and this is the system that allows us to save the heat. Just as a house loses heat through the cracks in the insulation, it also can lose heat through the windows. Now, the south-facing windows throughout the year have the potential for gaining more heat than they lose. But all the rest of the windows on the east, west, and the north stand to lose more heat than they gain. So we try to minimize the amount of windows used in the rest of the house. As you can see on this side of the house, we have very few windows, really just enough to allow for adequate cross ventilation. So it's very important to minimize the windows on all the other surfaces of the house so that you can save heat. And when we talk about saving heat, that's what it's all about. Just how much heat does this house save? Well, to find out, we thought we'd talk to the owner, Bob Ross.
I think it does save money, Bill, because our bill for the month of February through March was only $31, whereas a comparable house of this size would have run well over $100. We've been to see a lot of houses, and contemporary and some traditional type houses, and many of the layouts had problems with them, where rooms weren't located where they should have been, and the living spaces weren't organized properly. And when we first came into this house and walked around, we just got a feeling that everything was where it belonged. The dominant feature of a solar house, and something that we've grown to like about it, is that it gets you involved with what's happening outside. And this is something that we hadn't experienced before. And when you live in a solar house, you become more aware of how the sunlight, or what kind of a day it is outside, and the temperature it is outside, and what season of the year it is, and you just become more involved in the outside of the house, because the way the house interacts with what's going on outside is something that a normal house just doesn't do.
The house you've just seen was designed as part of a program to design passive solar houses for different regions of the United States, and was sponsored in part by the Southern Solar Energy Center. Houses were commissioned for design by the SSEC for several different regions of the southern states,